This is one of a series of good answers presentations, offering evidence to answer skeptical challenges to the Bible's accuracy. The book of Genesis has always been a favorite target for skeptics. Talking snakes in a garden, forbidden fruit, giants in the earth, people living for centuries, God scrambling men's language, Noah and all those animals, the list goes on. Today, I'd like to look at just one story from Genesis that is not so likely to cause the reader to scoff. It does, and has, though, caused many with a historian's viewpoint to raise an eyebrow, because it has three very unlikely sounding elements in it. And if Genesis claims to be history, composed under God's direction, it ought to be accurate, shouldn't it? Let's take a look. It's all about a war, as Genesis 14 tells it. Quote, "In the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim, these kings made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is, Zoar. And all these joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is, the Salt Sea." Genesis 14, 1-3. 4 kings against 5. Now, the valley of Siddim was full of slime pits, and as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into them, and the rest fled to the hill country. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah, and all their provisions, and went their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. Continuing the account. When Abram heard that his kinsman had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them. Then he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions, and the women and the people. A map might provide a little background for this narrative. As the writer has told us in Genesis 14, 5 cities, Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar, rebelled against their overlords to the north. The 4 kings, obviously unhappy at the potential loss of taxes, marshaled for a raid against the rebels. A battle ensued in the valley of Siddim, which went badly for the armies of the 5 cities. And given the overall focus of our narrative, we learn that Abram's nephew Lot was captured among them. But all is not lost. Abram has a large contingent of men in his employ, and some 318 of them accompany him in pursuit of the raiders. Catching them at night and unaware, Abram actually rescues the captives and recovers the loot. A happy ending, after all. Now, as a historical account, this is not much different from many we know from antiquity, or even more recently. Military exploits, when pursued with daring and courage, often succeed against odds. But still, there are 3 odd elements in this account that might well puzzle the careful reader. Here they are. First, what's this about a coalition of 4 kings in this expedition? Weren't Sodom and the others under one major overlord? Most of what we hear about the ancient Near East tells us of great empires: Egypt, the Hittites, the Assyrians, Babylon, Persia. None of them would need to call for help from anybody else to squash 5 upstart cities. That's rather weird. Then there is that strange explanatory note the writer offers when he tells where the battle occurred. Quote, "All these joined together in the valley of Siddim. The same is the Salt Sea." End quote. Huh? A valley or the Salt Sea? Can't be both, can it? Soldiers don't usually fight underwater. What could the writer mean by what seems a contradiction? And soldiers fall into holes? The account says, "Now the valley of Siddim was full of slime pits. And when the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some of the men fell into them, and the rest fled to the hills." How often do you see something like that happen? All 3 of these seem to call for some kind of explanation. First, the coalition. A look at a historical timeline shows up something a bit surprising. Very early Mesopotamian history is dominated by the Sumerians and then the Akkadians. Egypt goes back pretty far, too. And later, we see the Old Babylonian Empire, the Hittites, Egypt's New Kingdom period, the Assyrians, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and then the Persians. There seems to have been one dominant power in the region after another, sometimes 2 of them vying for superiority, but for one period. With the end of the Akkadian hegemony and of Egypt's Old Kingdom period, there occurs a kind of power vacuum. For a couple of centuries, while Egypt tends to internal affairs, the Mideast lacks a major power. And that's when Genesis 14 says this raid occurred in the 20th or 19th century BC. An expert on this period, Kenneth Kitchen, has this to say about that business of 4 kings from the north raiding 5 cities down here. Quote, "Thus, from circa 2000 to 1750, or 1650 at the extreme, we have the one and only period during which extensive power alliances were common in Mesopotamia and with its neighbors. Alliances of 4 or 5 kings were commonplace and modest then." That's Kitchen on the reliability of the Old Testament, page 320. Historians have a term for this: historical verisimilitude. The account would not make much sense either earlier or later in history, but just here it fits the geopolitical picture. For the second oddity, the Valley of Siddim, let's explore the Dead Sea. It's a great tourist destination today. People come from all over to float there, even if they can't float in pools, rivers, or oceans anywhere else. After all, where else can you read a travel brochure like this? But why is it the Dead Sea? You probably know. Its main source is the Sea of Galilee to the north, from which the famous Jordan River, only about 75 miles long, flows into its terminus, the Dead Sea, the lowest body of water on Earth. It's hot down there, and rainfall is very limited. So, what happens to the water in the Dead Sea? That's right, high rate of evaporation, and therefore an increasing concentration of dissolved salts, making its water dense enough to attract all those tourists who want to swim without effort. Don't ask, though, how badly they need to shower when they get out. And what's more, this sea has two distinct parts. In the north, about 2/3 of it, the sea is quite deep, almost 1,000 feet, in fact. But the southern third of that sea is very shallow. Indeed, it is so shallow that at times it dries up entirely. In its present state, it is used by the Israelis for the collection of minerals, since all of those salts have nowhere to go when the water goes down a couple of feet, and thereby hangs a tail. You might say that over history, the southern third has been a sometimes sea. Periodically, the water level goes down, and the southern third, being so shallow, dries up entirely. Geologists believe this was true in Abram's day, and so that region was the Valley of Siddim, where the battle we read about could be fought. But 5 or 6 centuries later, the water level was up again when Moses wrote the Genesis account, and that region was part of what he called the Salt Sea. His readers would need to know that. And that pattern of rise and fall explains our third puzzle as well. Those holes are slime pits. When the water level is high, so is evaporation, and salts precipitate from the water to form deposits. Then, when the water level is low and the area is dry, there's still some groundwater to seep through and dissolve some of those pockets of salt. The result, of course, is voids or caves and potential sinkholes. And so we come back to the text of Genesis 14. Now the valley of Siddim was full of slime pits, and when the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some of the men fell into them, and the rest fled to the hills. Genesis 14:10. But we might wonder how much of this is real and how much is rationalization. Well, recent history can tell us. Remember, this is a very popular tourist spot today, and there have been incidents. On January 3rd, 1998, a 21-year-old camper at En-Gedi, out for a walk, committed one misstep. He found himself falling into a 25-foot hole that wasn't there a moment earlier, and the park rangers had to close the campsite. Since then, there have been similar or worse happenings. Roads have developed sinkholes. Cars have gone down. Even a building. Some aerial shots of that region tell a rather scary story of what happens when salt deposits underground dissolve. It seems that troops from Sodom found that out, too. We come back then to a story from the book of Genesis, one with 3 strange elements in it. Maybe just a story, perhaps? Maybe just a fiction created to portray the Jews' ancestor Abram as a hero? Maybe. But if so, how could Moses, looking back 500 years, have known the geopolitical history, coalitions of petty kings, the climate history, rise and fall of the sea over centuries, and the effect of groundwater on salt deposits? When we examine those elements in historical context, they just serve to confirm Moses' accuracy. Historical verisimilitude shows itself, and a narrative that might have seemed questionable turns out to be right, down to the smallest details. If you have questions about this lecture, or any of the others in the Good Answers series, you may direct them to me, Dr. Jerry C. Ford, at yahoo.com.